Hello, everyone. My name is Shara Lessley, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to the official launch of The Door Left Wide, Irish Poets in Tribute to Eavan Boland. I would first like to thank the Vermont Studio Center, most especially Sarah Audsley, for their ongoing support of artists and writers, and most especially for hosting this event, as we know that there has been devastating flooding around the state of Vermont in recent weeks. I would really like to thank those of you who are joining us from abroad. I know that this is a very, very late start time for you, and we are absolutely honored to have some of Eavan's family with us, as well as our guest poets, Tara, Molly, and Padraig, whose work is so wonderfully varied and exciting. I cannot wait for them to share it with you. I would remind you that these are but 3 of our 22 contributors to The Door Left Wide. We also have an afterword by the wonderful scholar and close friend of Eavan, Jody Allen Randolph. I should say that I am indebted, of course, to Carolyn Kubler, the editor of New England Review, for making space for this tribute honoring Eavan Boland, one of the foremost voices in Irish literature. In her introduction to the current issue of New England Review, Carolyn describes the impetus of The Door Left Wide as grief in action. Of course, when I pitched the tribute following Eavan's death in 2020, what I didn't know was the sense of companionship and discovery that editing the project would bring. I put out the call for submissions while still living in Dubai and read hundreds of poems and remembrances for the next year and a half. The submissions told a story of what's happening in contemporary Irish poetry, patterns, fashions, and echoes of tradition, and to, of course, resistance to those very traditions. But the cover letters told the story of Eavan's legacy, the depth of her influence and importance as a poet and public figure. Taken together, these letters became an encomium praising Eavan's advocacy, her technical ambition, her defiance, her tenacity, her intelligence, and her vision. Her ability to imagine a future for herself in poetry beyond the misogyny of the 1960s, when she was told, and I do quote, "The best thing about your work is that you would never know that it was by a woman." The cover letters noted the various roles that Eavan played as an editor, a neighbor, an A-level course subject, an email correspondent, and friend. They told numerous anecdotes about Eavan gossiping backstage at literary festivals, or the confidence that she inspired in young poets whose work she accepted during her tenure for Poetry Ireland. I heard about her generosity as a workshop leader. One mother told me a story about a very difficult pregnancy that she had had during the pandemic and had happily delivered a healthy baby girl who she had named after her favorite poet, Eavan. Another writer told me about a scolding that she received from Eavan, who encouraged her to take her writing more seriously. And she expressed such admiration and gratitude for this particular conversation and the seriousness with which Eavan approached her work. It seemed that this scolding had sustained her for decades. Of course, all of the correspondents expressed admiration for Eavan's poetry, and particularly enthusiastic were women who said that for the first time they'd seen their lives reflected in verse. I think about Eavan's early poems in particular, set in the suburbs of Dublin, where we hear a crying infant and the sound of the kettle that is singing on the stove. Of course, the context for my relationship with Eavan is very different. I first met her almost 20 years ago when I was awarded the Wallace Stegner Fellowship in Poetry at Stanford University, where she directed the creative writing program for 24 years. It was there that she became my mentor. Like any great orator, Eavan had a keen sense of audience. And this became very clear when a dear friend of mine and I decided to sit in on her undergraduate course in poetry and poetics. That spring, the class took place in a large room that was almost like a theater. It had very great windows, and the light flooded through and offered plenty of distraction for the students. The syllabus was absolutely minimal. Eavan really gave nothing away, and I don't think anybody knew what to expect. It's also worth noting that in this very large section, it was populated by undergrads across all majors who had varying interests, so to speak, in literature. But when Eavan entered that room, she was charming, she was witty, she was insightful, and she was wholly improvisational. I don't think in the entire term that I ever saw her consult a set of lecture notes, nor did I see her even look at any margin notes in the anthology that she used or the handouts that she provided. And yet, she was able to really connect the poems to the current moment, even if they were hundreds and hundreds of years old. She could find that moment of curiosity, of subversiveness, of structural innovation or interesting rhythm in a poem that really made the students see just how relevant the art form was now. She created a sense of urgency. It was as if she knew that the future readership of poetry was in the room, and so her active teaching also became an active conversion. Now, the future of poetry was at stake elsewhere too, and that was in the Stegner workshop. But she wasn't looking to convert readers, but thinking about the writing. And in this setting, the temperature was a little bit different. She could be demanding, exacting, and absolutely formidable. She showed us time and time again that the smallest things in a poem have absolutely great stakes. She always worked from a cold read. She would simply put the poem unseen onto the table and narrow into the point that she found what she described as the difficulty, the thing that seemed to be holding the poet back. Whether it was pacing or tonality, structure, some ethical oversight, an issue with time management or mixed metaphor, she knew exactly how to uncover the shortcoming of a poem and put it in the larger context of what was happening in contemporary literature. We were warned against empty gestures, orchestrated resonance, that beauty could be made to serve empire. She modeled what I've come to think of as an ethics of attentiveness. What was being memorialized or made into myth, she asked again and again, and to the benefit or the expense of whom? And so now I'd like to turn to one of her poems. It's called History from Domestic Violence. And I want to consider the ways that she disrupts the given. Histories. That was the year the news was always bad. Statistics on the radio, the sad truth no less so for being constantly repeated. That was the year my mother was outside in the shed in her apron with the strings tied twice behind her back and the door left wide. In many ways, this poem runs contrary to much of Eavan Boland's work, at least formally. It's just 8 lines with rhymes binding bad, sad, repeated in the first quatrain, and outside, shed, tied, and wide in the second. Only the radio stands alone without a sonic counterpart, and thus becomes the authority for the poem. The title of the poem, of course, is Histories, and we are given 2 versions of history in the poem. In the first stanza, we have the news, the flat statistics of the radio, the record of daily events that are repeated again and again. Here are facts and reportage. And then there's a critical pivot as we turn to the second stanza and we find the mother. And she is mid-labor going about her daily tasks outside in her work apron, which seems to me a signature image that Eavan uses in her practice of domestic realism. And so you can see that these two versions are held apart. At the top half of the poem, we have the official past, this disembodied anonymous voice coming through the radio. And then beneath that, underneath that, we have what Eavan privileges, which is the human figure, the silent labor, the life lived that is so often overlooked. Now, this interaction between the public and private truths is really apparent throughout her entire body of work, and you'll hear the echo of that tension in one of her most well-known poems. And in this political narrative that personalizes the Great Famine, Eavan reproaches sentimentality, subverts lyric tradition, and expands the notion of the love poem. This is Quarantine. In the worst hour of the worst season of the worst year of a whole people, a man set out from the workhouse with his wife. He was walking, they were both walking north. She was sick with famine fever and could not keep up. He lifted her and put her on his back. He walked like that, west and north, until at nightfall under freezing stars they arrived. In the morning, they were both found dead of cold, of hunger, of the toxins of a whole history. But her feet were held against his breastbone. The last heat of his flesh was his last gift to her. Let no love poem ever come to this threshold. There is no place here for the inexact praise of the easy graces and sensuality of the body. There is only time for this merciless inventory. Their death together in the winter of 1847, also what they suffered, how they lived, and what there is between a man and a woman, and in which darkness it can best be proved. What Eavan models in her poetry and prose is clarity of thinking, that a writer can dismantle existing definitions of power, the poet, history, or even the love poem, that they can become the source of their own authority as they engage with new arguments, identities, subjects, tonality, viewpoints, and rhythms and forms. Eavan said that the test of a great poem isn't how much we've revised it in its making, but whether its making revises us. I know that I am not alone in saying that because of her rigor, care, vision, and discipline, I have been revised. Thank you, Eavan. And now I would like to turn it over to Tara.
Hello, thank you very much. That was wonderful, Shara. And I'm delighted to be here. My name's Tara Bergen, and I'm going to start by reading something by Eavan Boland, but it's not a poem, it's a section from her prose. I've printed out what I'm going to read, so if I'm looking down here, that's what I'm looking at. The extract is from the famous essay that she wrote as an introduction to her Norton anthology of poetic form, The Making of a Poem. And like most of us, I'm sure, I've turned to this essay many times. I read it when I'm stuck with my own writing, or when I have to teach a class and want to pass something on to the next generation of poets. And it does seem to me to be timeless, like an everlasting gift. Because I think that the lesson that this essay teaches is one of the most important and vital lessons that a poet can learn, which is ultimately the importance of combining an awareness of tradition with an alertness to the sound of the individual who is speaking and moving and breathing within the poem itself. The extract that I'm going to read comes just after Eavan Boland has set the scene. She's 34. She's living in a house in South Dublin with her young family. She can remember being 6 years old and hearing her father recite Blake's Tiger poem. She felt enchanted, she says, and oppressed all at the same time. She can also remember being 19, a university student living in a flat in Dublin, already writing and publishing poems, but still struggling to find her own place in that world. As she puts it, she was not yet a citizen of the enabling democracy of contemporary poetry. Now, as she speaks in the essay, she's in her mid-30s, she's aware that there had been an important moment of change at a particular point. And this was her ability to hear her own voice, the human voice, as she says, of someone living in the middle of her life. And she could have said someone living in the middle of their poem as well. In my head, I think of this extract as being called something like the music of dailiness. So this is Eavan Boland speaking. That voice I hear every day, which is my own voice, which is emerging from the deepest origins of myself, which is never practiced, rehearsed, or made artificial by self-consciousness, has begun to invade my lyric sense of the poem. Now, when I sit down to write a poem, I am determined that this voice will be integral to it, that I will hear it in the poem, just as I have heard it an hour earlier as I lifted a bicycle and said goodnight to a neighbour, just as I heard it when I opened the window of a child's room and put out the large brown moth that was fluttering behind the curtain. And it is that voice that now begins to shift the interior of the poem with its granite weights of custom and diffidence. It is that voice that complies with a life rather than the other way around. Without realizing it, I have come upon one of the shaping formal energies, the relation of the voice to the line. That simple discovery begins to dissolve all the borrowed voices of my apprenticeship. I begin to see how it would be to be able to work with the line by working against it, pushing the music of dailiness against the customary shapes of the centuries. Suddenly I see how these contrary forces make language plastic, and how exciting it is to find that a poetic language will liberate and not constrain. And that's from The Making of a Poem, edited by Eavan Boland and Mark Strand. And it still gets me every time I read it. Right, I'm now going to read you one of my own poems, which is extremely short, but I'm delighted to say appears in this issue of the New England Review. And actually, because it's so short, I thought I'll try and share the text with you as I read along. Otherwise, you won't know when it's begun and when it's finished. So let me attempt a bit of techno here and try and share my screen. And hopefully, what you can see now is a slide that shows the title of my poem. Right. Chronology of the Swimmer. In March, there was the refusal of so-and-so's proposal of marriage. In July, there was the second refusal. In September, there was the very first view of the sea. In early October, there was the ordering of a winter bathing costume. In November, there was the becoming buoyant. One might even go as far as saying, happy. I told you it was short. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm going to hand over to Molly now.
Yeah, so nice to be here. Thank you so much for including me. It's an absolute honor to chat to everyone this evening. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my experience with Eavan's work. So I first encountered Eavan Boland's work in University College Cork in a seminar as part of my undergraduate degree by Dr. Adam Hanna called Irish Poetry Since Yeats. And I decided to focus on her collection in her image, which absolutely blew my mind. So it was published by Arlene House in 1980, and there were drawings by Constance Short, and it was this old slim book. Well, to me it was old, obviously, but it was upstairs in the top floor of the Boole Library, and I used to go up there and reread it over and over. And I suppose the reason that I was so enthralled by this work was because it was unlike anything I had read before. Because in my big lecture hall courses, we were studying predominantly the work of men. We were studying Kinsella and Kavanagh and Yeats, and it was only in these small seminars that I got to discover Eavan's work, and also like the work of Sinead Morrissey and Rhoda Coghill. It was just incredible and mind-blowing, and particularly for me, it was so mind-blowing because at that time I was in recovery from an eating disorder, and one of the poems in Eavan's collection is called Anorexic, and it is about a woman who is suffering, and I suppose I was kind of uncomfortable reading it first, and I think now looking back, the reason that I was uncomfortable was because it's so honestly captured the experience in a really starkly kind of authentic way, which was interesting. So I think if Eavan, I don't think that Eavan suffered, I don't know, but I think that she certainly knew people who did, because it was perhaps one of the first times that I felt really seen in poetry, especially, you know, upstairs in UCC Library, looking through all of the poetry. It was this poem that really kind of caught me in my throat, and I also gave me a lot, to a great extent, it gave me permission to start writing about my own experiences as a woman and the different issues that I might come up with in society in Ireland. Yeah, so as well, there's a lot of references in anorexia to Catholicism, and particularly there's allusions to the biblical story of Adam and Eve and the subject's desire to subvert womanhood and to shrink back into a rib. And in my own recovery, I suppose I was also reflecting on my childhood, where I would have spent a lot of time in the church, and I would have taken Lent very seriously, and I would have thought that, you know, eating less was a good thing, and I remember conversations, you know, about pilgrims and how they were only eating dry toast, and this was amazing, and they were great, and they were, you know, avoiding sin. And I suppose eventually my body did become something that I kind of grew to be a little bit ashamed of, and hunger was something to kind of hide. And yeah, so I suppose I will read her poem now. Yeah, excuse me for speaking very quickly. I'm just a little bit nervous. Anorexic. Flesh is heretic. My body is a witch. I am burning it. Yes, I am torching her curves and paps and wiles. They scorch in my self-denials. How she meshed my head in the half-truths of her fevers, till I renounced milk and honey and the taste of lunch. I vomited her hungers. Now the bitch is burning. I am starved and curveless. I am skin and bone. She has learnt her lesson. Thin as a rib, I turn in sleep. My dreams probe a claustrophobia, a sensuous enclosure. How warm it was and wide. Once by a warm drum, once by the song of his breath and in his sleeping side. Only a little more. Only a few more days. Sinless, foodless. I will slip back into him again, as if I have never been away. Caged, so I will grow angular and holy. Past pain, keeping his heart such company, as will make me forget in a small space the fall into forked dark, into python needs, heaving to hips and breasts and lips and heat and sweat and fat and greed. Yeah, so I think just what she did, she kind of took what was, to a great extent at that time, what was going on in my head and put it on a page, and and it was kind of amazing. You know, I'd never the work of Leanna Sullivan as well, and Eavan Boland gave me permission to write about my own life, really, and kind of told me that it was worth putting in a poem, which is something that I'll forever be grateful for. So my own poem is called Lunch, which I'm grateful to have in this gorgeous book. And it also, I suppose, has that sense of duality where but this character, I suppose, in my poem is more recovered and is more in touch with her authentic self than Boland's speaker in Anorexic. But she's still struggling. And she has learned that her body is impossible to burn, and that she must go on and enter the world, and she can no longer kind of shun womanhood, but it's still hard, and she's still held back by her disorder. So it's called Lunch. She is trying to be less ashamed of her body. A Pyrex dish, impossible to smash or burn. To take the edge off the cranberry scone, a colleague leaves on her sticky notes. Her bright reminders to stop skin picking, scab flaking, bending a staple into a tiny baton. Granted, she's no longer in a stall. Terrified someone might hear the tear of a packet, the crunch of a bar, and after the retch of acid, a tooth chiming like a coin. If she had one wish, she'd enter the staff kitchen, that deep dish of plans and unmeasured laughter. Behind her monitor, her bulgur and broth, she listens as they slice and share what they butter fry, chili flake, dress with oil. And so I don't want to keep you too much longer. I'm gonna indulge myself and read one more of Eavan's work. And the reason I'm doing that is because I was really fortunate in 2021 to win an award in memory of Eavan, which allowed me to be mentored by Dorian Lux, which was amazing. And I suppose it comes from this whole, history and legacy of poets supporting each other and mentoring each other and being kind to one another. And I just wanted to read this poem because I love it so much. So it's Is It Still the Same? Young woman who climbs the stairs, who closes a child's door, who goes to her table in a room at the back of the house, the same unlighted corridor. The young night air over the wheelbarrows and rain tanks, the same inky sky and pin-bright stars. You can see nothing of her, but her head bent over the page, her hand moving again, and her hair. I wrote like that once, but this is different. This time when she looks up, I will be there. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening to me be very scared and speak very quickly. Thank you. And I will pass you on to Padraig now, who is amazing.
Thanks, Molly. And what a good thing to be involved in this. Thank you very much to everybody in you for the opportunity to be part of honouring Eavan Boland's work and life and the impact that she had on people through talking about Irish life in ways that that elevated and probed and deconstructed in ways that examined as well a kind of an international approach to the questions of Irish life by critiquing empire and also critiquing misogyny within the context of Irish stories. I have loved her work for many years, and I always loved the ways in which her poems could go and do a whole variety of things at the same time. I'm going to read a poem first and then say a thing or two about what I like about it, and then I'll read the one that I have inside this collection, which is very good and kind of Shara and everybody to have included. So here's a poem from Eavan Boland from the book In a Time of Violence, and the poem is called In Which the Ancient History I Learned Is Not My Own. The linen map hung from the wall. The linen was shiny and cracked in places. The cracks were darkened by grime. It was fastened to the classroom wall with a wooden batten on a triangle of knotted cotton. We have no oracles, no rocks or olive trees, no sacred path to the temple, and no priestesses. The teacher's voice had a London accent. This was London. This was England, 1952. It was ancient history class. Ireland was far away, and farther away every year. I was nearly an English child. I could list the English kings. I could place the famous battles. I was learning to recognize God's grace in history. The colours were faded out, so the red of empire, the stain of absolute possession, the mark once made from Kashmir to the ostbarns of the Kent coast south of us, was underwater coral. And the waters of the Irish Sea, their shallow weave and cross-grained blue-green had drained away to the pale gaze of a doll's china eyes, a stare without recognition or memory. She put the tip of the wooden pointer on the map. She tapped over ridges and dried out rivers and cities buried in the sea and seascapes which had once been land, and came to a stop. The Roman Empire was the greatest empire ever known, until our time, of course. Remember this, children. In those days, the Delphic oracle was reckoned to be the exact center of the earth. Suddenly, I wanted to stand in front of it. I wanted to trace over and over the weave of my own country and read out names I was next to forgetting. Wicklow, Kilruddery, Dublin. To ask, where exactly was my old house, with its front door, its brass 1 and 7, its flight of granite steps, its lilac tree whose scent stayed under your fingernails for days. For days, she was saying, even months, the ancients travelled to the oracle. They brought sheep and killed them. They brought questions about tillage and war. They rarely left with more than an ambiguous answer. I love the artistry of this poem, going in and out of the map, looking at it and then looking through it and then suddenly back to it. The teacher in focus and then suddenly looking through that extraordinary line of, I was learning to recognize God's grace in history, the weight of irony of an Irish poet saying that, and then suddenly the colors were faded out. To have such import present in the line and to have the enjambment present there, as well as then the stanza break, so much left unsaid, and the weight of what's left unsaid is heavy on the page. And that, I think, is one of the defining features of the brilliance of Eavan's work when it comes to speaking about history and when it comes to redefining history. The presence of land and the specifics of this too are so important. Wicklow, Kilruddery, Dublin, touching the map. And I think what you see is the politic of touch that you find so often in Eavan's work, that the politic of touch is one that says, without touch, can there be politic? Is it possible to have a public imagination of language without the public imagination of touch? And she brings that so often into her poetic forms. And I think it issues a query and a challenge that goes much beyond poetic form and artistic representation. Yeah, I think it asks a public political question. I'm going to read the poem that the New England Review have published. This one is called Dynamite Comes from a Greek Verb. Dynamite comes from a Greek verb, dunamis, meaning power. Dynamo too. You can sense the rhyme in that spine of doom. Dynamic? Yep. And dynasties from dynasties. If you look a little closer, you can see the testes in that word. By now, you've noticed dynasty hides nasty too, right there in plain sight. I almost titled this poem Nasty, but I didn't want to give the end away. Instead, I chose restraint, another kind of power. A little bit is lovely if it's chosen, awful if it's not. All this started as a sonnet, but it's nowhere near an ending. Back to power. Not that we left. English got dynamic from the French, who got it from the Germans, who learnt it from a guy named Leibniz, a hopeful sort, who studied Sanskrit, never married, never thought the Pope was Satan, though he didn't think that power sat its ass on a lonely chair in Rome. Anyway, here's a story. Long ago, some children sat at desks in a school in Alexandria. The tutor, male of course, what else, pointed at a verb for conjugation. Dynastai, he said, and dynastai, they chimed. He wasn't schooling small dictators in the art of being cruel. He wasn't teaching tiny monarchs how to act like pricks. He was not enlightening his novices in how to get their way. He was simply teaching them how verbs work. Can you introduce your father to the emperor? Can you reproduce the maps of all our major roads in all our lands? Can you control your household? Can you claim a lover by the way you use your tongue? Dunamai, they'd all reply. Obedient little children. I am strong enough. I am able. One of the things that I take strength from in Eavan's work is the commitment to putting things alongside each other that we all know to be true, but we all know can be difficult to speak about. Domestic violence, in a time of violence, against love poetry. Just even thinking about the titles of these collections. To bring to the surface that which is already at the surface, and to name things at the surface. I have found such courage and strength in the power she exhibited in doing that, speaking about power, speaking about misogyny, speaking about violence, speaking about resistance, and holding all those things in the body and offering them up through language. Lots of my work is really in debt to the courage that she exhibited, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be part of this. And I'll hand it back to Shara Lessley now. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I love hearing that poem in particular because I've always maintained that power is Eavan's true subject. So thank you to each one of our poets. It's wonderful to hear her words in your voices. One of the things that she used to say was that the reader is the co-author of the poem, and that the poem is not truly complete until it finds its reader. And I was struck also hearing Molly's sort of connection with the anorexic poem, and thinking about the way in which the thing that can make us feel different or marginalized or outside within the art form isn't necessarily adversarial, but that it can become our greatest creative ally. And I think that was something that Eavan was very much interested in, and modeled for so many of us, as she insisted again and again that we need to make poems that we can live inside. And so I thank you, the three of you, so much for sharing your thoughts on Eavan. I would like to go ahead and perhaps ask a question of our three poets, which is, I know that Molly spoke about her first encounter with Eavan's work, but if I could hear maybe from our other two poets, do you remember the first poem of Eavan's that you read and what that experience was like, and sort of how you felt about encountering her work for the first time?
I'll speak up there if I can. Well, I do remember I came to it quite late to Eavan's poems. I'm sort of ashamed to say, really. But anyway, it was at a class kind of seminar where a poet brought in a poem that they really admired, and we all sat around and talked about it. And it was the Black Lace fan that my mother gave me. And I was just reading it again today to remind myself of it. And it's that shock, like Molly talked about, the kind of the feeling you get in your throat when you're reading something, and which reminds me, I think Robert Frost said poetry is grabs you by the poetry grabs life by the throat. I think that's what he said, and that seems to be kind of what she manages to do. And that there's a way that poem goes to its final stanza that is such a shock. And it again, like Padraig was demonstrating both in his poem and how he talked about Eavan Boland's poems, that way that the kind of the body of the poem and what it's doing and its artistry and all that kind of thing, like it's such a wonderful display of the workings of poetry. It's a shock, and that's, all the best poems are a bit of a shock, aren't they? So that's what I remember.
I think I came across the book in a time of violence when I was living in Australia in about the year 2000 in a library. So I was far away from home, and I saw Boland and I saw violence, and I thought, I had a teacher, Mr. Boland, in school, so I just assumed, I wonder if this person's Irish, and then picked it up in the library. And this poem, in which the ancient history I learned is not my own, was one of the ones that stuck out to me from that book. There's so many in the book that do, but partly, I suppose, looking at the map and seeing your own country tiny on the map when I was so far away and living in a huge country. Reckoning with history as well, reckoning with being Irish and an Irish speaker, and the ongoing legacy of that, and trying to talk to myself in Irish every day when I was living away, so as to make sure not to lose the fluency and the connection with the language. I felt a real connection with what she was doing, even though she's mentioning more place and connection and location in this poem rather than language. That this poem really went into me in terms of the experience of so many people of feeling more connected to home when you're in exile, and that sense of angst that you can have when you're far away, which is a great theme, maybe a complicated theme in Irish history and in Irish literature. But I love, therefore, especially what she does when she honours Ireland. She also probes Ireland and deconstructs Ireland, and doesn't speak about Ireland in such a way that is just fanciful and isn't just romantic. There's so much about it where she pushes. In the final book that was published posthumously, The Historians, there's a line in it where, in this poem called Eviction, where she's talking about Ireland emerging as this, partitioned but almost complete country, and at the same time there is an account from a journal about a forebear of hers having been evicted, and she says, where's the line? I have it here. A woman leaves a courtroom in tears. A nation is rising to the light. History notes the second, not the first. Nor does it know the answer as to why, on a winter evening in modern Ireland, I linger over the page. and then it goes on. And I love what she does about Ireland in that way, that it isn't a sentimental approach to the question of Ireland, even though she does get into the angst of being a small country where people have moved far. And I found that to be present right from the time I read her, right up until the final book that came out.
I know that I have spoken with so many friends and colleagues over the years about Eavan's tremendous influence here in the States, but I am curious for our Irish poets tonight, if you might speak just a little bit about what you think her influence is in Ireland as a writer or an editor, even a teacher. If you might be able to give me some idea about that, that would be wonderful.
I was politely letting somebody else talk, but you know, why be polite at moments like this? Her influence as a teacher. Well, actually, Molly said a word, kindness, and I think that's something that I think is really important, because I certainly remember that I met Eavan Boland only once, and it was when we were doing a kind of reading. A performance, actually, it was a weird thing. We were doing a performance of Yeats's poems in the National Concert Hall. It went on for hours. And first of all, I noticed that Eavan had brought a little shawl with her, which I realize now was her knowing how cold you get if you have to sit on the stage for a long period of time. So little things like that I learned from her, but her general sort of atmosphere was one of kindness, extremely kind to me. I was nervous, and she was just acted like we'd been friends forever. And you know, we were sitting beside each other, and she'd sort of lean over every now and again and say something gossipy, as you mentioned earlier, like just very kind. And I think that when you're starting out in poetry, you don't know what you're supposed to be like. Are you supposed to be like ambitious and hard-headed, or what, you know, what are you supposed to do? And having somebody like that as a model, that you can think, well, she was a great poet, and she was kind, and she was enabling. I think those sort of things have maintained, have definitely have their legacy, and I think that's wonderful. It's like it's a nice feeling to think that us poets like each other, you know. I don't know if that even answered the question. I'm sorry, I sort of went off there, so I'll stop talking now.
I only met Eavan once as well. It was at the launch of the last edition of Poetry Ireland Review that she'd been editing for a number of years. And so really what I knew her for was her poetry, and I loved the short editorials that she wrote in Poetry Ireland Review. And they were rarely longer than a page. It was one short article she wrote about Patrick Kavanagh turning up in a time in Dublin where people were using the trope of the peasant poet, and here was a real one, a peasant poet, and they hated him. And she put so much of his life in context. And I loved the dexterity of her prose and the way within which there was great drama in it. In some of her editorials, she spoke about, you know, the controversy which seems to come in and out of fashion about form or not form, or about, you know, page or stage poetry. And she told an anecdote about being in a room where somebody had said, "I want to sign my poem," a student, I think. And she initially had thought, oh, that's going to take away from the page. And then she realized what language does in sign. And in a short few paragraphs in an editorial, I think she showed me a way of looking at poetry and a way of holding together all the ways in which poetry can happen. Page, stage, signed, recited, you know, dramatic presentation, whatever, all of them. And to say there's room for it all. And she that was in the same edition where she referenced Patrick Kavanagh in an article halfway through. And I thought, who is this person who can do this so well? And who, in a way, was opening many gates to say, go in whichever one you want. And there's room for all of the approaches. And in undoing so much, I think, of the tendency towards a certain kind of localism when it comes to my own small corner of the field of poems, to say this is the way it should be because it's my way or it's the best way. And she was just saying, look at the amount of space there is in this vast field. And I loved the intellectual prowess of that as well as the generosity of it.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's definitely that sense of empowerment to write about, you know, your own life. And I think I've certainly been at workshops and given workshops where I've heard women in particular talking about Eavan's influence on their work, and particularly if they are mothers, that sense that, you know, the work of motherhood should be in a poem, and that permission, and also the drive to write better. You know, I think someone was talking earlier about someone writing in that they should take, Eavan had said they should take their poems more seriously, because I remember she was on her last, I think the last issue of Poetry Ireland Review that she was going to be editing, and poets I was at a reading somewhere, and two poets said to me, you have to submit because it's Eavan Boland's last issue and you absolutely have to submit. And I was like, oh, I have to submit, and they have to be amazing because she'll be editing. And so I worked on them for so long that I missed her issue, and it was Colette Bryson that was editing after. So I think empowerment and the drive to get your poems as powerful, I suppose, as you can.
I think that that's absolutely true in so many ways. All three of you, what you've said about her influence on women, of course, she was always interested in expanding the conversation. In my enthusiasm at the beginning, I think that I skipped over something that I feel is really important as well, which is that for all of her seriousness and rigor, she was very, very funny, and she was an absolute pleasure to be around. I feel so fortunate for the private conversations that we had and the time that we shared together. And I'm grateful for this time that we've shared together. I'm going to go ahead and close this evening by reading one final poem by Eavan Boland. This is an older poem, and I'm not sure how well known it is, but for me, it's a really beautiful reflection, and it anticipates so many of her poems to come, including some of the well-known known ones like the pomegranate. There's a lot happening in this poem, and it's one that I greatly admire. So I'll thank you in advance for joining us again this evening, and I will close with Suburban Woman, a Detail. The chimneys have been swept, the gardens have their winter cut, the shrubs are prinked, the hedges gelded. The last dark shows up the headlights of the cars coming down the Dublin mountains. Our children used to think they were stars. This is not the season when the goddess rose out of seed, out of wheat, out of thawed water, and went distracted and astray to find her daughter. Winter will be soon, dun pools of rain, ruddy addled distances, winter pinks, tinges, and a first thing smell of turf when I take the milk in. Setting out for a neighbor's house in a denim skirt, a blouse blended in by the last light. I am definite to start with, but the light is lessening, the hedge losing its detail, the path its edge. Look at me, says the tree. I was a woman once like you, full-skirted, human. Suddenly, I am not certain of the way I came or the way that I will return. Only that something which may be nothing more than darkness has begun softening the definitions of my body, leaving the fears and all the terrors of the flesh, shifting the airs and forms of the autumn quiet, crying, remember us. Thank you, everyone. And please be sure to check out this wonderful issue of New England Review.